you for joining us to consider the global implications of the still unresolved US elections. As we convene today, the United States President is actively and flagrantly intruding into the vote certification process. Global awareness and a sense of history allows us to appreciate that this unseemly behavior is really a surfacing of long-hidden power plays and anti-democratic tendencies that define the US Republic of race and capital. Before offering a short analysis of the elections, I will share our program for the event. After my co-facilitator Liz Mestris and I briefly frame the elections, we'll turn to short presentations from Rose Brewer, Patrick Bond, Ana Silvia Monzon, and Sahar Francis. We will then engage in a brief conversation in which the speakers will comment on and respond to each other's opening remarks. Then we will turn to all of you, asking you to share your comments and questions in the Zoom chat. If you're joining on Facebook, please post your remarks there and we'll try to get to them as well. We'll close with short statements from each of our speakers. Let me return to the elections. Even while we appreciate the fact that the election is a rotation of elites and not a political realignment or social transformation, we would be remiss if we do not recognize, firstly, the huge social mobilization that made possible the majority's rejection of the most reactionary faces of US capitalism. The successful efforts of communities of color, youth, and former trade unionists to rally members to mobilize, not only to push voter registration and voting itself to all-time highs, but also to transform the voting process and produce an unprecedented turnaround from voting in person to voting by mail, and increasing the turnout of voting by mail. Moreover, they accomplished this under conditions of COVID lockdowns, and more importantly too, especially in places like Philadelphia and Kenosha, Wisconsin, under occupation by repressive police forces, higher than usual repression. By contrast, in communities, particularly rural ones, less affected by COVID, the Republican mobilization proceeded by traditional in-person means and produced huge turnouts by both the right and by people with legitimate grievances, but ones organized to blame the wrong people. At the same time, decades of base building and deep networking and literally centuries of super exploitation and unresolved grievances have ensured that other political processes are at work, ones outside and well beyond the electoral arena. This summer, in this pandemic, one of the largest sustained social rebellions defined the Northern Hemisphere's summer and continues to simmer, ready to reignite at any time. Taken together then, the grassroots mobilization, at the electoral level, with the conscious choice of the lesser evil, coupled with a popular rebellion, means that the usual process of demobilizing the base will not be an automatic outcome. The future is very much a contest. With this in mind, and before turning to the global dimensions that our speakers will address, I would like to introduce Liz Mestris, my co-facilitator. We'll turn to some of the more challenging themes of our moment, that barbarism of our moment may be replaced with the prospects for extinction. Liz?
Okay, hello everyone. I'm delighted to be involved in this amazing panel with speakers and thinkers and activists from all over the world. It's clearly a time of great danger and uncertainty, but we certainly do need each other. So, and if there's any silver lining to this pandemic, it is that it's helping us to think globally while acting locally. And although being locked down is a bit too local for me, when we return, or if we return to in-person meetings, I'm sure that we will continue to try to have these global meetings as well. We're certainly in a difficult time. Rather, as indicated in the title, we're focusing this discussion rather than on the spectacle of the elections that we find in the media. in the structural elements of the unprecedented situation that we face globally, which could be described as an unraveling of empire or as a multidimensional crisis of capitalism that is social, political, economic, and ecological at the same time. So one of the main questions that I have is, has capitalism reached its limit? There's many we've thought that in the past. I'm a product of the 60s movements, and we thought revolution was around the corner. The Marx himself thought that capitalism was past its prime, as he put it. So what are our challenges? What are our possibilities? These are the another way of looking at what we're talking about today. So anyway, I would like to introduce our first speaker, Rose M. Brewer, who is a sociologist who teaches at the University of Minnesota Twin Cities. And please say a little bit more about yourself, Rose. And I turn the floor to you.
Okay, thank you. It's good to be here sharing the panel. And thanks to those of you who put this together in these quite tumultuous times. I am certainly a sociologist, but have always found most of my energy by being connected with struggle and the idea of being a revolutionary in the context of doing academic work is not fully embraced in the US, but increasingly it's apparent that it's going to take all of us, and especially given the current moment. And I'll speak briefly to this moment in the context of the US. Let me be very clear that the history of white nationalism is long and deep in the United States, and is at the heart of my remarks about the US elections today. While it is quite true that there are distinct underpinnings to today's white nationalist articulation, the country's formation as a white settler colony, hierarchically rooted in white supremacism, emerged early and signaled the deep foundational roots of color preference, gendered hierarchy, and class. This frame anchors my comments regarding Black movement formation today and its centrality in the electoral defeat of Donald Trump, continuing the long durée of resistance to these foundational forces of racial capitalism. Indeed, my contentions are rooted historically. Before Charlotte, there was Baltimore, and before Baltimore, Ferguson, and before Ferguson, and so on and on. There is the long march of anti-Black resistance against anti-Black violence, and a negation that continues into the current period. It is imbricated in this era of Trumpism and global rightward nationalism. There is persistent greed, war, and militarism, which stoke racial hatred and are inculcated in the capitalist internal struggles over the right face of US hegemony today. Those of us within the heart of this empire reject it foundationally, fundamentally. As the Red Nation in a recent piece articulated about the US elections, the large voter turnout, especially among Black and Indigenous working poor, showed that large sections of the populations vigorously oppose the ugly reality of Trump's politics. Simultaneously, the election reveals the extensive support for those same politics from a significant share of the population rooted in the logic of white supremacist capitalism, 73 million. Of course, we can disaggregate that number. There are varied reasons, but certainly there is a social base for what could potentially be a fascist response. Importantly, the will to rebel against this order persists. Black movement formation in the US and increasingly the revolutionary embrace of social transformation against globalized capitalism are real. Why wouldn't it be? Given the ignoble, ugly, and violent history and present of the nation and its formation, the deepest roots are in the conquering and building of a white settler colony, highly militarized and genocidal. The country took economic flight in racial slavery, expropriating Black labor and bodies, seizing indigenous lands, being and culture. This is the instantiation of white supremacist violence, deeply intertwined in the very operation of the social order. From the 15th to the 19th centuries, the expropriation of Black labor would be the great engine of Europe's wealth. The British entered into this buying and selling of human beings, building its North American colonies. African women, men, and children produced sugar, tobacco, rice, indigo, and of course, cotton. Capital for banks, shipbuilding, universities, shackle making, and riches for the few. And today, Black bodies shackled in mass incarceration continue to express a particular kind of racism, anti-Black, intractable, deeply rooted, and very difficult to extricate given its embeddedness in class exploitation. It is constitutive of both symbol and material realities, state and economy. In this context, the economic, ideological, and cultural practice of anti-Blackness planted a seed of fear, threat, and hatred of the Black body. It is rooted in the ethos and fundamentals of US society. No doubt, removing Trump is a must, while still confronting a Biden presidency situated in the same neoliberal policies that catalyzed Trumpism. We will still have to contend with war and aggression abroad, austerity, economic dispossession, and police repression at home. And indeed, the arrogance of a Joe Biden who sees himself as the head of a world table reveals direction. As Medea Benjamin so cogently asserted recently, the US can't organize itself, much less the world. Benjamin is referencing Biden's claim that, quote, the world doesn't organize itself, end quote, and that it needs the US to do it. The question of whether the US can organize itself to deal with a pandemic that has killed 250,000 plus people, disproportionately Black, brown, and indigenous, is at the heart of the matter. Profits and stock prices, political interest over the people will continue to dominate, and we must interrupt it. And I would add, the empire will be deadly in its decline. The Black Lives Matter struggle drives the force of uprise in the US today and signals a period of high contention, resistance, and change. It is also rife with contradictions. Get the booth of racism and white supremacy off of Black necks. This is at the heart of the struggle that must be anti-capitalist. The movement is global to stop killing us. Nigeria is currently a potent expression of this rise up against state violence. Yet from within Black life, a segment of the Black leadership elite in the US has strongly embraced the neoliberal capitalist position. Certainly Harris as VP, the impact of this powerfully placed group of Black pundits, centrists, conservatives, and liberals is tellingly articulated in the rise of the Black neoliberals. So the struggle for decolonizing minds and building consciousness continues and is connected to the issue of ending state violence, defunding and abolishing the police, investing in the people. The current period is complex, difficult, and dangerous. This is not the agriculturally based, newly industrializing South of 1954 that spawned the civil rights movement, nor is it the triumphant and still relatively new empire of the 1960s that was not fully dismantling of racial apartheid. This spawning of Black power and the Black liberation movement in this context, we all remember so well. Those today in uprise since the murder of George Floyd in my city of Minneapolis, May of 2020, do so in a time of intense capitalist austerity, pandemic, and state violence. The narrative asserting abolition is prominent. Defund the police is embedded in this history, and it's at its most radical, a theory and practice of fundamental social change. As critical resistance scholar, abolitionist Ruth Gilmore asserts, more police are not the answer to the deep structural issues of economic dispossession, state and interpersonal violence, recognizing and protecting our humanity. The answer is not replacing one repressive system with another. We're contending with deep economic dispossession and the social death of bad, no housing, no work, no possibilities for too many, and yet uprising resistance and the ongoing struggle for Black liberation. How do we get free? Deep levels of disrespect and humanity must be challenged. We have a situation that demands social transformation. So I'll just end with these final few remarks. As the disposability of lives become ever more visible in the everyday operation of global capitalist society, we know state violence will intensify given the structural realities and rebellions of the current moment. Thus, we must demand and organize our most righteous solidarity across time, place, and condition, our deepest internationalism, our sharpest strategic direction, and tactical vision. At the center of this rise up are the courageous, the forgotten, those deeply harmed by state violence, economic, political, and social dispossession, anti-Blackness, class exploitation. These are the driving forces that say no more. Thank you.
I thought I was unmuted, sorry. Thank you very much, Rose. And now we'll turn to Patrick Bond, who is a political economist and geographer who teaches at the University of the Western Cape in South Africa.
Wow, hard to follow Rose with such powerful analysis. What I'd been asked to do, I hope it's fine, is to explore a transition from do you call it a paleo-conservative version of imperialism with the isolationism and the critique of multilateral institutions that the Trump regime had foisted on the rest of the world. And now, let me say, perhaps a fusion of the neoliberal and neoconservative politics that we'd witnessed under Obama, sort of following seamlessly from George W. Bush. If that's the transition process, my task is to quickly tell you where I think counter abilities are. Will they come from a middle layer, which by coincidence met this week, the BRICS, the Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa bloc, which sometimes has an aura of anti-imperialism, but I'll argue is more akin to sub-imperialism in the spirit that a Brazilian, Rui Mauro Marini, whose work is being published very soon by Monthly Review Press in English, and also David Harvey in Disclosure, he was my doctoral supervisor, sort of a sub-imperialism argument. Particularly because this week, the cohesion that had sometimes been apparent in the BRICS in arguing for a different kind of response to the Trump phenomenon seems to have broken apart. Or secondly, will we look at the radical international social movements or protest phenomena that generally have risen up over the past decade opposing austerity and authoritarianism? So in a few minutes, let me tell you quickly, if you haven't heard of the BRICS, they came about in part because of a gold who Jim O'Neill, who thought that the Brazil, Russia, India, China group, and South Africa was added in 2010. But in 2001, he was projecting exactly this, that is the rise of these four major economies. Just taking one data point, the trade as a share of GDP, it really did look like these were the countries moving up and driving globalization to the next stage. But from 2007, the deglobalization problem, where trade to GDP, foreign direct investment to GDP, the cross-border finance flows to GDP, all those major ratios that indicate corporate globalization was on the march, actually went into reverse, and they were driven indeed by the BRICS. And one rescue mission in 2008 from global imperial power centers, particularly with George Bush pulling together a G20 in the 2008 during the financial crisis, where they desperately needed to reflate the world economy and revitalize the International Monetary Fund. The G20 came into being. At that point, the G8 included Russia. 2014, they were kicked out. But you can see that Brazil, China, India, and South Africa were brought in at this point. And that was, again, largely financial, but it became a sort of geopolitical project to widen the scope for imperial domination and multilateral control. That was, for example, the International Monetary Fund regularly going in 2015 to recapitalize, to get more money from these other countries. And Brazil and China, especially India and Russia, did very generous contributions to keep multilateral global corporate politics going. South Africa couldn't really afford it. So when the IMF, for example, had its tallying of the votes, the voting share, it looked like BRIC was revitalizing the IMF, and South Africa lost a fair bit. So did Nigeria, so did Venezuela. It looked, therefore, that the assimilation of these countries was fairly successful. But there was some problems, and some of us picked these up in, early on. We've had such a vibrant debate. I'm going to just give a couple of my friends who I disagreed with then, and now I think they may have a different point of view. But this was a sense that the BRICS countries had a mortar that binds them, as Radhika Desai, really wonderful political economist, sort of founder of geopolitical economy theory from University of Manitoba, has put it, that the contingent reserve arrangement would be an alternative to the IMF, the BRICS New Development Bank, an alternative to the World Bank. And there was the peak moment in the Durban summit of the BRICS in 2013. Horace Campbell, who's from the Caribbean, but spent a lot of time in Africa and is based at Syracuse, has even gone on record thinking maybe this contingent reserve arrangement, the CRA, which is $100 billion fund, would replace the IMF as a provider of resources. And of course, we had Jacob Zuma, who until 2018, when he was kind of tossed out in a palace coup in his own party, was the most explicit. He was, trained in the East Bloc and anti-apartheid revolutionary politics. And the ANC is part of a global anti-imperialist movement. We're connected south-south with the BRICS primary for the movement. He even was poisoned and got his antidotes from whatever magical place they have in Russia to give the fix. And he was poisoned. He almost died just because South Africa joined the BRICS under my leadership, he said, 4 times actually, blaming the CIA for this. So you can see a sense in 2013. 2014, we see the rise then of Modi. In 2018, Bolsonaro comes to power. But already, while there was let's call it a sort of talk left political leg that was in place, there was an economic leg, globalized neoliberalism. And our greatest African political economist, Samir Amin, suggested, look, some of these countries in the BRICS and in the South, they can at best walk on one leg. They reject the imperialism, especially rhetorically, economic neoliberalism, which made the BRICS very, very difficult to claim to be anti-imperialist, really. Now that several right-wing countries emerged within the BRICS bloc from 2014, India, Brazil in 2018, indeed in 2016, when Dilma Rousseff was overthrown in a parliamentary coup in Brazil, and in South Africa when Ramaphosa came to power, as Vijay Prashad put it, they basically, none of them had the appetite to drive an agenda against US dominance. In fact, some of them were the Trumps of the tropics, like Bolsonaro, who Trump even said, hey, we can maybe bring you into NATO. And here's, of course, Narendra Modi, and when there was a sense there that hydroxychloroquine would be the sort of solution to. Of course, India's had this reputation of being the pharmacy for the third world, and Modi would produce a great deal after Trump bullied him a little bit. So these are the sorts of characters that made the BRICS far less of a counter-hegemonic possibility and more divided. And the divisions were economic, with Brazil, Russia, South Africa flailing around after their peak around 2013, 14, before the global commodities ended, and the price of the materials, the raw materials that they produced ended. India, China continued to grow. But here's the really important point from the standpoint of coherence in counter-hegemonic politics. The Belt and Road Initiative, as China moved out, having own infrastructure expansion internally, looking for ways to deal with what I would call an overaccumulation of capital, a spatial fix moving its capital outwards. There were lots of conflicts, and some of them are with the United States, and of course the US, as John Pilger's wonderful film, I think still very relevant, maybe more so with Biden, shows an encirclement of China. But the critical conflicts, in fact, were two BRICS brothers fighting. And in Stockholm in 2017, Lipulek earlier this year in June, fisticuffs actually in Lipulek on the India-Tibet-China border there led to dozens of the Indian troops. Without going into all of the gory details, they're not allowed to bring guns to the site of battle on this border, but they threw each other into the freezing rivers of the Himalayas off the mountains. Quite extraordinary. So scores of Indian and Chinese troops died. And the real prize for them is a little bit further to the west, that is Jammu and Kashmir. And as you probably know, Kashmir is a sort of colony of India and hotly contested with Kashmiris, about 15 million wanting independence, and Pakistan there being a critical geopolitical point because its alliance with India means that India doesn't want to be part of the Belt and Road and has dropped out and was even thinking about dropping out of the BRICS as a result of that conflict. What happened this week's interesting. Let me very quickly give you what I think my dear colleague Vishwas Satkar in this book, which he edited, and I have a chapter explaining sub-imperialism theoretically, and you can download it for free if you look for BRICS and the New American Imperialism. It came out earlier this year. The question posed, do BRICS have the capacity, institutional arrangements, the coherence to articulate an alternative? And if the amplified neoliberal multilateralism serving the BRICS and the West, the regional displacement of the overaccumulated capital, the sort of deputy sheriff function of many of these BRICS within their own regions, the financialization, the super exploitation, because that's where Hoimaro Marini found the critical point of BRICS internal accumulation was through a huge proportion of the labor market being reproduced at a price employer less than the cost of reproduction. So that includes especially extreme patriarchy, where women are carrying that extra cost, and for nature, dramatic forms of natural resource extractivism. So the BRICS all generally promote extreme spatio-temporal fixes and the predatory condition known as accumulation by dispossession. In other words, contrary to my dear comrades like Radika, like Horace, like the late Andrei Vilcek, there wasn't really much scope given these structural conditions. And this week we found this to be very much the case, where Sergei Lavrov, the very talented foreign minister of Russia, was able to pull together the summit, mainly because they decided they would do something very Islamophobic in my reading, which is to say counterterrorism is what's going to draw us all together in future, which kept Modi in because of his Hindu nationalism, which kept China in because of in the west of China, and of course Russia's had its problems with repressing Muslims going back decades and generations. So whereas luckily in South Africa we're not in that situation of Islamophobia, we might be because of the northern Mozambique gas, where there's an ISIS attack, and our foreign minister a couple of months ago said, well, maybe we should bring our own army out there because of the oil and gas sort of shades of Yankee imperialism in our own little region. Imperial condition, isn't it? Okay, so there's no alternative there. And very quickly, I know I'm surely out of time. There is an age of mass protest. I mean, we have to take it from the Center for Strategic and International Studies. They call these places think tanks. Is that right? Naomi Klein once said this, right? It's a place where people are paid to think by the people who control the tanks, and CSIS is certainly the premier think tank. And they did something in April this year. I don't know if any of you saw it, which is or March, the Age of Mass Protests document, really tracing the last decade or so from particularly the North African uprising, the Arab Spring, Occupy, the struggles in Turkey and in Spain and Brazil, Ukrainian revolution, all these protests in the Middle East, North Africa, Asia, North America, Sub-Saharan Africa. So updating it, of course, bring the US right to the fore. But across the world, and I'll just focus a little bit on where Africa is. I think I'll skip through all of these different factors that they found with the sort of uprisings, because for them it's all about neoliberal democracy, that is free markets and free politics. And we know that these, kind of shoring up global democracy, pushing back against authoritarianism, as CSIS puts it, and the late William Blum has so well debunked. US imperialism needs that veil of democracy, doesn't it? Some of these were genuine revolutions, some were US promoted. But I think the critical thing is nobody really saw some of these coming. Here's The Economist looking at the North African and Arab Spring conditions, saying, no, these are moderately sort of unstable, but basically, as Dominic Strauss-Kahn from the IMF said, no, everything's going great in Tunisia. It's the best model for the third world, and gets all these awards just as Muammar Bouazizi self-immolates because of the combination of neoliberalism and authoritarianism. And this is, again, with the World Bank at the same time in early 2011. So the protests go on, and as our documentation, and here's Development Bank acknowledging, they spike in 2011, but they keep going up and up in the African continent. And many of them are against this predatory accumulation by dispossession. You can map onto the resource, sort of oil, gas, mineral, and to some extent cash crops of Africa. A correlation to the protests. Similarly, in Africa, we've had extraordinary labor mobilizations, very organized labor movement. Trade unions are weak, but the African labor movements are considered the least cooperative and collaborative. Protests and riots are measured all over, and they've led overthrows. Egypt, Burundi, Tunisia, South Africa, we've had various uprisings in different conditions. Ethiopia, Kenya, Nigeria, Algeria. These are sites where during the last decade, uprisings, where in a place like so the great memory of Thomas Sankara comes up, and Blaise Compaoré, who basically had him killed in 1986, I think it was, 87, then was overthrown in 2014. And we could just go through this list of tyrants, many of whom were just imposing neoliberalism on other people. Now, this continued with Sudan and Algeria, the sites last year of protests, this year in Mali. Some of it comes from, do you remember the elephant curve in which the global protests, if you say, well, look, there's a rise of dissent in Britain, particularly with Brexit, and with all of these, it takes a proto-fascist form, right, or a right-wing reaction, a right-wing populist form. So it's a very interesting time where 47 countries a year ago were in major civil unrest. Many across the African continent that aren't often seen. Latin America, of course, this year with Chile, with many of the other Latin American countries and protests. And I think, although I know I'm way over time, I'd just like to end with a couple of our own struggle sites, because even during COVID, with lockdown, with very severe police repression, we've had very dramatic increases in protests after a little decline in April and May. But spirit of fighting authoritarianism and fighting neoliberalism, that with the Biden regime, a great deal more of the amplification as the neoliberal, neoconservative version of imperialism replaces the Trump paleo-conservative version. Watch these spaces, dear comrades, and I'll be watching and learning.
Thank you, Patrick. Patrick, okay, great. So I have the pleasure of introducing the next two speakers. If Rose Brewer's talk ended with a call for solidarity across time and place and movements, and Patrick provided us with a sense of the structural limits to solidarity, at least from the state system or the sub-imperial order, then it is important that we discover other places, other sites for solidarity, the very places where Patrick concluded his talk, with the rise of resistance in unexpected places and in unexpected times and under unexpected conditions in the global south, as well as from Rose's talk within the heart of imperialism itself. In this vein, then, our next two speakers represent two regions of the world where we see the US imperial order play itself out or express itself in its most brutal and callous forms. The first speaker who we have in the second part of the program then is Ana Silvia Monzon, who's a feminist and a feminist communicator, a sociologist who teaches at Flaxo in Guatemala. She will be assisted in her presentation by Sienna Mann, an activist interpreter from Colorado, who organizes with People Strike. Ana Silvia, and you're muted right now. Ana Silvia, your turn.
Buenos días. En primer lugar, muchas gracias por la invitación. Me siento muy honrada de compartir con ustedes y agradecer sobre todo que pueda hacerlo en mi idioma materno, el español, que hayan hecho estos arreglos para que todas las voces podamos ser escuchadas.
Thank you so much for the invitation to be here. It's an honor to be with you. And thank you again for making the arrangements so that I can speak in my mother tongue, making the arrangements with the interpretation.
Voy a presentar brevemente para no perderme con el tiempo y he titulado mi presentación Mujeres Centroamericanas, Pobreza, Migración sin Garantías de Derechos, un círculo perverso en pleno siglo XXI.
I'm going to present my presentation so that I don't lose track of time, and I have titled it Central American Women with No Guarantees of Human Rights.
Mi primera pregunta es, ¿Centroamérica cuenta en el ámbito geopolítico? En el 2021 se va a conmemorar el bicentenario de la independencia en Centroamérica. De esos 2 siglos, un siglo ha sido Estados Unidos una influencia que ha marcado la dinámica política, económica, social y cultural de la región. Desde finales del siglo XIX, Centroamérica fue considerada esa área de influencia, sobre todo durante la Guerra Fría entre 1945 y 1989, cuando cayó el muro de Berlín. Y durante todo ese tiempo, y sobre todo en los años 40, 50, los países centroamericanos fueron convertidos en repúblicas bananeras. Así es como se denominaba de una manera peyorativa. Los entramados de poder hegemónicos configuraron entonces unas élites conservadoras, anticomunistas, dependientes del mercado estadounidense y supeditados a los intereses geopolíticos de los Estados Unidos. La responsabilidad de Estados Unidos en varias invasiones a la región centroamericana, como Nicaragua, Guatemala, Panamá y Honduras en este siglo XXI.
The first question I want to ask is, does Central America count? In 2021, we will celebrate the bicentennial of the independence of Central America. And we see in this last century that the influence that the United States has, in the sense that it has absolutely marked the political, military, economic, social, and cultural dynamic of our region. Since the end of the 19th century, Central America was considered a really important area of influence for the United States. Of course, above all during the time of the Cold War, And we say pejoratively that these regions were converted into banana republics. The lattices of hegemonic power were configured through the conservative elite, which was anti-communist and very much dependent on the United States market, and above all, deeply aligned with the geopolitical interests of the United States. We see the United States, they are responsible for invasions in various countries in Central America, which includes in Nicaragua, Guatemala, Panama, and Honduras, as part of their larger geopolitical role in the region.
En Guatemala, en 1954, marcó un antes y un después. La reacción de Estados Unidos a la voluntad de que Guatemala quería desarrollarse de manera autónoma en el contexto de la Guerra Fría, provocó esta invasión que unos años más tarde dio lugar al inicio de una política contrainsurgente que costó 200,000 vidas, 45,000 personas desaparecidas, aldeas arrasadas y miles de familias desplazadas al sur de México o a otros países de Centroamérica, y que también provocó un flujo cada vez mayor de migración hacia Estados Unidos por las condiciones de pobreza que esta guerra interna nos dejó.
The invasion of 1954 we consider there a before and an after. The reaction, this was a direct result of the reaction from the United States that Guatemala wanted to develop independently, autonomously. And it gave rise to a counterinsurgent war, a reactionary war that led to the loss of 200,000 lives, to 45,000 people disappeared, to villages razed, to thousands of families displaced internally, to the southern Mexico and to other Central American countries. And of course, this really initiated a flow of migrants that is always increasing to the United States.
Hacia finales del siglo XX, en 1996 en Guatemala, 1994 en El Salvador, se firman acuerdos de paz para poner fin a esos conflictos armados internos que implicaron reconocimientos de derechos, sobre todo para los pueblos indígenas y las mujeres, que han sido los más excluidos en estos procesos, pero el reconocimiento no implicó redistribución. Y en esos años también se evidenció un aumento dramático en el crimen, en la violencia juvenil y la violencia social en todos los países de la región, con excepción de Costa Rica y en alguna medida en Panamá. Se abrieron mecanismos institucionales para atender las demandas y la garantía de derechos, pero estos pronto fueron debilitados. Y hoy, en el 2020, vemos a estados y sobre todo el de Guatemala, que es uno de los más pequeños a nivel global, y que no responde ni siquiera a la agenda del desarrollo humano, como hemos visto en esta pandemia y en la respuesta a las emergencias humanitarias de estas últimas 2 semanas, cuando Centroamérica ha sido azotada por huracanes. Sin embargo, el Estado y sobre todo Honduras y Guatemala han tenido una respuesta muy lamentable, incluso a esta emergencia humanitaria.
In 1996 in Guatemala and in 1994 in El Salvador, there were signed peace agreements that recognized rights for indigenous people and women, but there was no process of redistribution. And in those years, we see a really dramatic increase in crime, in youth violence, and of course, what they call social violence in many of the countries of this region, except with an exception for Costa Rica and maybe Panama. So although this opened a lot of institutional mechanisms to attend to human rights demands, these were very quickly debilitated. And in 2020, presently, we see that our country, Guatemala, which is one of the smallest on a global level, is one of the countries that least responds to the agenda of human rights development. And we have seen this in how they have handled the pandemic. Of course, other humanitarian emergencies such as the hurricanes that just assaulted our countries as well.
Uno de los efectos que quiero destacar de este proceso y sobre todo en los últimos 20 años es la crisis migratoria, porque se firmaron los acuerdos de paz, pero no hubo ningún cambio en la economía. La economía se abrió muchísimo más y se puso al servicio de los intereses extractivistas, que significó y sigue significando despojo, desalojo y expulsión de comunidades enteras en Guatemala, el norte y el occidente, pero también en otras regiones de Centroamérica. Y esto ha significado entonces un aumento significativo de migrantes, de mujeres, sobre todo, a lo que quiero llamar la atención, porque las condiciones de pobreza y la violencia las están empujando a buscar otras oportunidades para sobrevivir. Y como un dato, las mujeres en Centroamérica somos aproximadamente 24 millones y han migrado del total de 48 millones de habitantes de Centroamérica, más o menos entre 4 y 5 millones que viven en Estados Unidos, la mayoría en una condición indocumentada.
One of these contexts that I want to highlight is the migratory crisis. So even though these peace agreements were signed, we didn't see any material change in the economic reality. And the impact was that even though the economy was opened, it was in service of an extractivist economy, an imperialist economy that really has meant the expulsion of communities, the displacement of communities, mostly in the north and west of the country, but also we see it across the country and in other countries of Central America. The other thing that I want to mention that is very important is that we see more women migrating because of the conditions of violence and poverty that has not guaranteed their rights to live without violence. And so they are really being pushed. And a fact I want to share is that women are approximately, there's approximately 24 million in the region. And of those people, almost 4 to 5 million have been pushed to the United States, and the vast majority are living in undocumented conditions.
Como podemos ver en esta gráfica, que la muestro rápidamente, ha aumentado significativamente el número de personas que migra y que migran por las condiciones de pobreza, el desempleo, los bajos ingresos. Solo en Guatemala el 70% de la población no tiene un empleo decente, no tiene un empleo que le permita ni siquiera sobrevivir. También está perfilando esta identidad de los migrantes climáticos porque las tierras ya no producen, y los efectos en una región que es muy vulnerable, pues se están viendo ya de manera importante en los últimos años. De manera que la situación de la migración es uno de los problemas más serios para la región centroamericana y para las mujeres en particular, que como vemos, ellas se tienen que hacer cargo entre el 20 y el 30% de hogares en Centroamérica tiene como jefa a una mujer, y esto pues les recarga la responsabilidad familiar, además de la violencia doméstica, sexual y el feminicidio, que como sabemos es realmente una situación en el mundo que enfrentan las mujeres centroamericanas, de El Salvador, Honduras y Guatemala particularmente.
We can see in this graphic the number of people who have migrated over the years, and you'll see a continued increase as time has gone on. And of course, these are people who are being pushed by poverty, by unemployment, and by low wages, and who really can't find a decent job and cannot survive. Given the economy. Of course, we're also seeing a major increase in climate migrants. The land is no longer producing. There's obvious changes that are affecting the region, and it's an incredibly vulnerable region in this sense. Migration is one of the most serious problems facing Central America in this time, and it's especially great for women. We see that about 20 to 30% of households in Guatemala have as the head of their household a woman. And then of course, those who do not, they're left to care for their children, but they're also facing domestic violence, sexual violence, and feminicide at incredibly high rates, especially in El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala.
El otro enorme problema es la violencia, sobre todo contra las niñas y las mujeres. El número de hechos de violencia se ha ido incrementando en los últimos años. Y esto pues es especialmente marcado, como ya decía, en El Salvador, Guatemala y Honduras, que solo en 8 años ha habido 13,000 muertes violentas de mujeres. También hay un aumento de los embarazos forzados, producto de violaciones en niñas tan pequeñas como 10 años, lo cual es una problemática que lamentamos muchísimo porque es una violación flagrante a los derechos de las niñas, las adolescentes y las mujeres. Por otro lado, tampoco hay una justicia que realmente le ayude a las niñas y a las mujeres. Hay pocas denuncias y mucho menos sentencias, de manera que hay un alto nivel de impunidad. Y todo esto también provoca la salida de las mujeres como migrantes.
As I mentioned, there's really significant violence against women and girls. And this is especially marked, especially in Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, where we saw 13,000 violent killings of women in the last 8 years. The other thing that we are seeing is forced pregnancies, which is a product of rape. And these numbers are very high. And it's a horrible and flagrant abuse of their rights. The numbers of cases that are actually denounced or reported are very small, and the sentencing or any consequences that may be seen as a result of those reports is even smaller. And so we see the impunity really persisting with very few consequences.
Y esto ha provocado también la salida de muchísimos niños y niñas no acompañados, que provocaron una crisis en el 2015 en la frontera con Estados Unidos, donde miles y miles de niñas y niños quedaron atrapados prácticamente. Y esto pues ha ido provocando una situación cada vez más difícil para las familias que se ven separadas, que muchas ya nunca se pueden reunificar, no se pueden reencontrar. También los casos dramáticos de muertes de niñas y niños en los lugares donde el ICE los lleva. Ha habido muertes por negligencia y ahora recientemente la denuncia de esterilización forzosa a mujeres migrantes.
This has really provoked also the fleeing of children. We saw a mass number of unaccompanied minors fleeing Central America in 2015. Of course, these children were left abandoned or trapped, and it's been very difficult for families to be reunited or for families to even find each other as a result. And we've also seen a lot of deaths of children. And of course, we are now denouncing the forced sterilization of migrant women that we have seen in detention centers.
Todas estas situaciones, ¿verdad? Se están dando mientras avanza un discurso antiderechos fundamentalista que en parte en la región centroamericana y sobre todo en Guatemala fue parte de una estrategia incorporada en la estrategia militar para socavar las bases críticas del catolicismo por los vínculos que sobre todo quienes sustentaban la teología de la liberación tenían vínculos comunitarios, y una forma de romper estos vínculos fue introducir las iglesias neopentecostales como parte de esa estrategia, y estas iglesias particularmente niegan derechos a las mujeres, y esto cada vez es más evidente, sobre todo los vínculos con iglesias en Estados Unidos.
We have seen all of this as we see a discourse that is anti-human rights and a really fundamentalist discourse that is advancing all the time. And one of the strategies that we saw was to really create a new church. The Neo-Pentecostal church was actually part of this strategy. They're implanted into communities with ties in the United States. And we see in these spaces the fierce negation of rights to women as well.
Bueno, ya terminando, planteando cómo el impacto de los cambios políticos en Estados Unidos para la región centroamericana no significan algo significativo, aunque haya estilos distintos, un énfasis distinto, se espera, si se resuelve también esta situación que se está dando en Estados Unidos inédita, una menor presión en torno a los derechos sexuales y reproductivos para las mujeres, posiblemente más apoyo para prevenir y erradicar la violencia en la región, pero a nivel económico no habrá transformaciones. La vida de las mujeres y de las niñas, de los niños, sigue marcada por ese entramado de poder entre el norte, entre los Estados Unidos y las élites locales. Pero en todo tiempo, y con eso quisiera ir cerrando, las mujeres se han organizado y se han movilizado. Los pueblos indígenas también, desafiando ese poder global, nacional, local y familiar. Las mujeres son una fuerza en los territorios y en la defensa de la red de la vida.
And to finish, I want to share a reflection on the impact we will see with this political change in the United States. Ana, ¿puede regresar al último?
Perdón.
Gracias. We don't think we will see a significant change, but perhaps a change in style for the region. Of course, we hope that there will be some more pressure, and to see support in eradicating violence, sexual violence, and reproductive rights for women. But at the economic level, it is very unlikely that we will see any sort of transformation. The lives of women and children will continue to be influenced by the dynamic of power between the North and the local elites in our country. But I want to finish by saying that throughout all of this time, women have organized, they have mobilized, they have resisted this, the power structures that be at the global, national, local, and even familial level. And women are really the fierce defenders of our territory and our lifeline.
Muchas gracias por este espacio, gracias Sina. Y bueno, aquí continuamos. Un abrazo y seguimos en esta lucha que ya es de muchísimos años, pero hay que continuar.
Thank you so much. Thank you for this space and for the interpretation. I send a fierce hug to all of you, and the struggle will continue. We will continue the struggle always.
Thank you, Ana Silvia and Sienna, for this presentation. I should say that as I listened to Ana Silvia's presentation, I was reminded of the fact that whenever I hear a presentation that addresses the violence of all against all, a presentation dealing with gendered violence, it's often presented as a bare set of facts rather than something in a deep historical context. And the benefit of Ana Silvia's presentation was to provide that historical context, the structures of domination that produce this war of all against all, and the fact that movements are now responding to these situations. In fact, in the United States, of course, Trump came to power by trading on the fact of migration. The very processes that brought him to power were the same processes that were producing the migration. In fact, Trump himself was no stranger to very directly and personally employing immigrant labor. The flip side to all of this is that in the mobilization, in the last election, in this 2020 election, immigrants played a crucial role, not only as new voters in the United States, but for those who were undocumented. They were nonetheless able to mobilize their communities so that those who could legally vote, in fact, voted to help bring about the transition. Similarly, of course, the great revival of the weapon of a strike, of the general strike in 2006, was made possible largely by immigrants from Mexico and from Central America. As such, these movements of people, while forced, while unwelcome by the people forced to move, are nonetheless also movements shake up the system and bring about opportunities for change. With that in mind, another region that has produced a progressive diaspora, one that has shaken the entire region into which it was pushed, is of course Palestine. And so we turn to Sahar Francis, General Director of the Ramallah-based Alumni Prisoner Support and Human Rights Association. Sahar.
Hello, and thanks a lot for including me in such a very interesting session. And unfortunately, I'm not an academic, so don't expect that my presentation would be with academic analysis. And I'm really a lawyer working for long time in the Palestinian occupied territories. So it would be kind of more elaboration about how this region, how the occupied territories would be affected actually by the United States foreign policy and the changes on the level of the last election. I totally agree with Rose that it's the time for abolition not just for the police brutality and state violence, but for prisons, for walls, for settlements. Because here in the occupied Palestinian territories, actually, it doesn't matter much if you have a president coming from the Democratic side or the Republican side. It was always the case that the United States foreign policy was totally supportive to the Israeli state and their strategies and their prolonged occupation for the occupied territories. And actually the last government in Israel led by Netanyahu was relying much on this US support. And I think I'm not going to enter into, sorry, is it clear?
Yes.
Yeah. I'm not going to enter into much details because there is much of things going on the daily level here in the OPT, but I mean, just seeing what happened in the last 2-3 years in the occupied territories in relation to the strategies that the United States, led by Trump, were imposing on this region. Starting with moving the embassy, the United States embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Actually, it's like it's not just a saying, it's always that the United States was not in favor of respecting international law when it comes for the conflict Israel-Palestine. It never happened that that the United States was supportive for the Palestinian people's rights based on the international resolutions or international decisions from the Security Council or the General Assembly. It was always the case that the United States was helping Israel and giving a support for the Israeli governments to violate international law and still not to be liable or not to be accountable for these war crimes or crimes against humanity. Let me remind you that Israel bombed Gaza in 2014 under the Obama regime, and they killed 2,500 people, and the United States did nothing. So it wasn't just the fact that Trump decided to move the embassy, that the only act actually that shows the main policy of the United States toward the Palestinian cause. This is caused for other countries actually, like Brazil, to think about moving the embassy. And for us, it means a lot in the position of Jerusalem as an occupied city, because Israel annexed Jerusalem and they don't refer to Jerusalem as a part of the occupied territory, which means if states now starts to consider Jerusalem as the capital of the state of Israel and move there, I mean like both sides, East and West Jerusalem, and move their embassies and consider Jerusalem to be only the capital of the state of Israel, this is by itself a violation for the international law, for the decisions that East Jerusalem in the UN level, that East Jerusalem is part of the occupied territories actually. This is actually caused as well tension on the ground, demonstrations, mass arrest campaigns by the Israelis, and more violations for the people's rights, house demolitions, and continuing actually with expanding the settlement projects in East Jerusalem and also in the occupied territories. This was a green line for the Israeli government as well to continue with all the violations, with all the harassment that they cause on daily level for the Palestinians. It followed with the restrictions on the Palestinian Authority by as well closing the representative office of the PLO in the Washington. They were imposing financial restrictions on the Palestinian Authority. Of course, this is also again gave the Israelis a green line to freeze the money of the taxation that the Israelis are supposed to collect for the Palestinian Authority out of the Oslo Agreement and the financial agreements between the two sides. And this is what was leading the Palestinian Authority this year, although with the COVID complications, to reject the Israeli conditions in May and to refuse to get this money because Israel was trying to enforce that the PA should stop paying the support for the prisoners and their families and to the martyrs. And actually the PA said, no way, we will not accept this condition, and they will not take the money from the Israeli side. Unfortunately, after the election, and the PA were a bit more comfortable with the fact that Biden will be the next president. So they immediately declared that they will go back to the relations with the Israelis in the level of security arrangements and to accept the money of the tax that the Israelis were holding so far, almost for all the year 2020. This is, of course, I'm not going to discuss, and I'm like, I feel like the Palestinian Authority actually is the weakest side, and this is why for them, they will take all these pressures in order to maintain their power, and the fact that they are leading the Palestinian people, because last month they were supposed to reach an agreement with Hamas after Hamas actually controlling Gaza, and out of the division that was since 2007, they were supposed to reconcile and declare that they are going to make the election in the Palestinian context, because the last time that we had election actually was 2006. I wanted to highlight several things that brings me to the issue of the solidarity that we should think about between people's struggle, whether in Palestine, whether in Latin America, whether in other occupied contexts, as well inside the United States. Because I believe without changing the policies inside the United States, nothing will change. We need to change the way of thinking in the United States policy, foreign policy especially, versus the international law, the UN bodies, especially a organ like the International Criminal Court that were sanctioned as well by the United States in order to protect the Israeli war crimes and not to be brought to the ICC. All the war on terror, actually, that how the United States manipulated the use of the war on terror in order to fight us as Palestinians, for example, on the level of even the most peaceful movement that we could have against the occupation, the boycott, divestment, and sanction that is considered to be a terrorist act by the United States, anti-Semitist, and they are attacking and trying to illegalize any kind of PDS work or anyone that is associated with the PDS movement. And the latest thing that they came and declared that any product from the Israeli settlement from Area C should be labeled as produced of Israel. This is a clear position on the, like giving the permission, clear permission for the Israelis to annex actually Area C, which is more than 60% of the whole Palestinian occupied territories. If Israel is going to annex Area C, what we mean by having a Palestinian state then in the future. So as an organization, as a Damir, we were always interested in the movement inside the United States concerning political prisoners and prisoners in general, and people who are working against the prison industry in the United States. And I think this is the way how we should more coordinate and associate our movements together in order to bring the change, because we have to think about the international law, the human rights law, as the framework for everyone, no matter if you're white, black, if you're in the north, in the south. Human rights were supposed to be protecting every human being in this world. And I think we have to go back to the discussion where we can enforce countries and states to respect their obligations under the UN Charter, the human rights that is actually can guarantee all our rights as people. So thanks again, and I think we can discuss more the ways how to associate our work together.
Thank you, Sahar. I should say that in the last few days, especially as Pompeo visited occupied territories and essentially ratified the Trump administration position with respect to the occupied territories as being part of Israel, I think that you've pointed us in the strategically correct direction. We need to ensure that change happens within the United States, in a way echoing Ana Silvia's concerns about what happens with immigrants when they're in the United States. I would also add, though, that in the last few years, at least, with the progress of the BDS movement within the United States, the Zionist lobby is no longer as unchallenged and no longer a singular voice about policy toward Palestine and Israel. As a consequence, I think that we are seeing a slight shift within the United States as a result of social movement activity led by young Jewish people, as well as by, more importantly in some respects, young Arab Americans, by networking with people directly in Palestine and elsewhere. As a consequence, I think we arrive at an important theme for this whole presentation, the connections between what happens with resistance inside and with resistance outside, bypassing the structures of the states and their prerogatives, as well as, of course, the movements of capital, even though all of this is shaped ultimately by the movements of capital and the dynamics of racism and patriarchy that have been instituted. I'd like to turn now to all of us to sort of think collectively. We've heard 4 different presentations with very different entry points, yet all of them terminating with resistance as an important component. Do you have any questions for each other?
I have a question for Ana. Curious about what kinds of connections have been made with feminist organizations here in the U.S. There is a World March of Women chapter through Grassroots Global Justice, and I'm curious about whether or not there have been those connections. I can remember traveling to one of the regional forums in Guatemala. It's been quite a while ago, but it was just after the military. They had just gotten rid of the military. So that's my question. I won't belabor that, but that connection possibly.
Thank you, Rose. Ana Silvia, are you able to answer the question? Or I know that Sienna has left right now. Hina, were you able to
Yes,
interpret?
I'm trying my best. I'm here.
Thank you.
Dale,
So
dale.
everyone, Hina Vargas from Peru will be playing Sienna's role next.
Okay.
Ana Silvia?
Gracias, Rose.
Gracias, thank you. Dale.
Efectivamente, sí hay relación con la Marcha Mundial de las Mujeres.
There is relation with the World March of Women.
No, digamos, también hay relación con mujeres migrantes en Estados Unidos.
Also with migrant women in the United States.
De hecho, estamos trabajando con compañeras en California.
They have been working with women in California.
Desde un programa de radio que empezamos en el 2009, que se llama Mujeres Abriendo Caminos, que ahora se trasladó a una radio que se llama Radio Jornalera de trabajadores y trabajadoras en California.
Ya, ok, dejen un ratito. Ellas están, they are doing this kind of connections since the 2009 and with a network that is called Women Are Opening Streams, no? And opening spaces. And now they have a radio program that's called Radio Jornalera, and from that for working migrants in California and in connection with Guatemala.
Gracias.
¿Algo más? Está bien. Ya. Okay.
Thank you. I'm wondering, Patrick, if we could also pick up this theme of global solidarity and the networking of movements. I ask this to you because as it's relevant to this talk, you've been active in networking and connecting movements across the world in many different methods, as well as by virtue of your work in South Africa in support of Palestine solidarity. Are you satisfied with the level of cross-movement organizing and networking, particularly in response to entities like BRICS, as well as the imperial powers themselves? I should add also, on the question of Palestine, it's always seemed as if the BRICS alliance would present some sort of alternative. Do you see any hope there with respect to Palestine?
Well, just on that very point, Sharon, I mean, first, BDS is so terribly important to promote. And the best proof of that comes from your home country, where I am in South Africa, where BDS was quite central to overthrowing apartheid. It was obviously the internal protest, but people like myself in the process of identifying corporate profits that were being drawn from especially Western European and US companies. And there's a great model for the way I think Sahar would agree, right? The South African strategy, which was to have one person, one vote in a unitary state, a genuine democracy, which we did achieve in spite of all the setbacks socioeconomically and environmentally. Of the weakening of the capitalist presence in South Africa, the Western capitalist presence, through divestment, through the delegitimization that the power relations shifted so that the African National Congress could demand a vote. Sahar probably can say much more about whether South Africa continues to inspire, but let me use that to segue to the other BDS, which is fossil fuel companies, because Sharon, that to me is the next step to universal struggles. That is, we're all facing climate catastrophe in different ways. Certainly in South Africa, we've had, in your hometown, Sharon, currently what's called Day Zero, where it's called Nelson Mandela Bay Metro, is, this doesn't have any water. Cape Town nearly hit that 2 years ago. Meanwhile, there are massive floods. A year ago, 71 people drowned in Durban, and just up the coast in Mozambique, 1,000 people died. So we're very conscious now of both climate victimhood and villainhood, because South Africa is the major emitter on the continent with the huge coal-fired electricity and many other ways in which emissions spew from our capitalist industrial structure. So then I wanted to ask all of you, first, is totally in league with the US and the Biden, Obama team, Hillary Clinton, Todd Stern, who in 2009 began the process of a fake became the Paris Climate Agreement. And I don't think there's any merit to promoting Paris because it has so many profound flaws. So what is happening as an alternative, Sharon, to get to the point, and maybe in all of the countries involved, you're thinking this through. If the global balance of forces is still adverse, if Joe Biden has been hiring fossil fuel industry lobbyists all over the show to his transition team and no doubt to his cabinet, then what do we do? So reviving not just the youth, Fridays for Future's been strong after lockdown ends, they'll be out again. Extinction Rebellion and Ende Gelände in Western Europe, very inspiring. I think the environmental justice movements all around the world from below really have had put climate justice, not just climate action, on the agenda. So I guess I'd ask my fellow panelists in the audience, can climate be the site? Because Sharon, the other alternative is to revive the World Social Forum, right? As and then Jai Sen is on the call, and I'd love to hear his thoughts. He's the thinker about how the WSF can be put back together now after some very bad years of degeneration, NGOism and so forth. So those to me are the central questions for global coordinated civil society. And maybe it brings me to the last question to the rest of our comrades. Does this moment require an ideological leap of courage to start naming global capitalism and imperialism as our enemies, partly because even though COVID-19 seems to have some capitalist companies generating vaccines quickly with massive state subsidies, right? The big question is whether capitalism can solve these problems: inequality, financial turbulence, and especially the climate catastrophe and all the geopolitical tensions within its own logic. Or are we at the point of socialism or barbarism? I don't know. Ideologically, our comrades around the table and in the audience able to enlighten us? Where do we stand with building an independent international left that names imperialism, and especially with Biden, bringing back neoliberalism and neoconservatism in his unique way, with probably a degree of competence that Trump couldn't match. But at the same time, the deeper processes of capital accumulation being an explanation, the deeper processes of class struggle, of feminism, and of especially the demand that we have climate justice. These are all aspects that capitalism, I don't think, is going to deliver. What do you think?
Yeah, surely if you put U.S. empire in the center of this conversation, especially about climate, and if it's going to have some resonance with those communities that are in upsurge, you always have to think of the profound and deep way that white supremacy shapes any kind of response. For example, those frontline communities that are most impacted by climate change also are most impacted by other kinds of dispossession. And if that isn't an interactive and integrated analysis, just asserting a climate struggle alone will not catalyze the communities I'm very aware with. And I do know that increasingly that particular component of our struggle is articulated, but it takes some care when you're dealing with, once again, frontline communities that have been most impacted by fossil fuel emissions, by we could just think about Katrina and the desertion of the Black poor in that city. So in the context of the belly, you really always have to think about how deeply capitalism has been imbricated with racism and white supremacy. Otherwise, it becomes very difficult to think about building the kind of solidarity. And I do know that in the earliest, and I'm thinking from the perspective of the Black Lives Matter upsurge. I do remember when I guess Ferguson and the death of Michael Brown and the upsurge that happened there. There was quite a bit of solidarity between Palestinian youth and Black youth in the U.S. I'm not sure how much that has been maintained, Sahar, but maybe you can speak to that. And I will say the hopeful sign in the U.S. regarding your second point around the possibility for a deep structural analysis of imagining and even catalyzing a socialist future, that definitely is on the lips of organized entities, including People's Strike, including many of the newly emergent socialists, you might call them democratic socialist initiatives, but unheard of in the US until the current moment. And I'm speaking from, of course, a US-centric perspective, but I would say not out of possibility at all, as a direct answer to your query, Patrick.
Thank you, Rose. Does anyone else want to address the question of the possibility of an ideological leap as proposed by Patrick, or pick up the strategic centrality of climate justice, or address the question of the World Social Forum. At this point, given where we are in the program, it might be useful to involve people who have joined the conversation, not as speakers, but primarily to listen, but now perhaps to ask a question or two. I'm thinking in particular with respect to the question on the World Social Forum. Hina, did you want to speak to the possibilities of the World Social Forum reviving itself without the challenges of the past? Hina Vargas, by the way, is part of the organizing team and also on the International Council.
Yeah, well, very shortly, after very difficult moments of not having too much clarity how to do or where to go, now I think that the World Social Forum is beginning to look for more openness to another movement. No, we have been from the IC. I am speaking about from the International Committee. This International Committee is an old-fashioned organization. We are there since the beginning. There's no new groups significantly, but now in the last months we have made meetings, virtual meetings with other movements, very interesting, with the forums that have been developing as migrant forum, alternative economic forum, or Amazonic social forum. All these have come together to open more the idea of what can be in the contention of the forum. The first thing that we are doing now is in January, a virtual forum, and it would be very interesting to spread this idea, because as more as movement participate and give some kind of perspective, it would be better, no? Because the thing that was a problem or a dispute is if the forum has to be only an open space for the movement, or if the forum is a political subject that has opinion about the things that are happening in the world. I'm not so clear with the open subject position, because you don't know never ever what is going to be decided as important in the movements, no? But well, that discussion now it's more quiet, and the effort is to take more and more movements in this experience of the virtual social forum in January, preparing the forum of Mexico that they want to have it in presence. I'm not so sure, at the end of 21 or beginning of 22. That is what I can report you. I can send also some documents.
Okay. Thank you, Hina. So we'll share more information via our channels and via the movements of movements.net about the World Social Forum. I'd like to circle back to Patrick's question, both about the ideological leap and about climate justice. In particular, Ana Silvia referenced the storm systems that are hitting Central America right now as we speak in succession. Ana Silvia, what is the place of mobilizing and coordinating around climate justice in the work that either you're doing or that you'd like to see happen? So we're waiting while Hina interprets for Ana Silvia. I'm sure that none of us remembers the silent movie era, but this is a nice version of it. So in a moment, Hina will provide an interpretation of Ana Silvia's response.
He says in relation to climate emergencies, there is a communitarian answer that is confronting all these things and trying to look for alternative. But what she is more, she's interested in saying this. She's interested in to say that the struggle, it's not has to be global, as all of you are saying, but not only global. Against capital, but also anti-patriarchal and anti-racist, anti-colonialist, because the left is so weak in this moment at the national and the international level that we have really to think how to put more interesting ideas. Well, that's mine in this. I hope that is clear. ¿Entendieron? Did you understand?
Okay.
Just on that, could I follow up just for a second? It's just to ask, are reparations for the climate damage in Central America on the list of demands? They certainly came up a year ago when Cyclone Kenneth, the Durban rain bomb hit, and really only about 10% of the damage physically, in addition to the thousands of lives totally disrupted, 1,000 lives lost. But the activisms, including Rural Women's Assembly, Center for Natural Resource Governance, these are really rooted groups saying, well, where the hell's the reparations from the global north, including South Africa, for causing this problem? So I'm just curious, is that coming up? If BLM is very much about identifying the need for reparations, would that extend to the North's climate debt? And the reason I ask is because I'm certain for Joe Biden, this is one of those red lines. He will not allow the discussion of climate debt and reparations, north to south, to get onto the agenda.
Right.
You know, Patrick, before we turn to that, I'd like to turn to Sahar to address the situation in Palestine, where, of course, all of these questions play out in an even more extreme way when we look at the hijacking of Palestinian water sources, and also the activity of the Israeli state and Israeli-based corporations in providing solutions, as it were, to the climate crisis and water shortages. So, Sahar, as you consider these questions and as part of the anti-colonial struggle in Palestine, how do we look to the problems of climate change and the challenge of climate justice, while at the same time thinking through the prospect of future reparations? Sahar.
I think in this question really needs the way of how we can associate and connect our struggle with other struggles, because alone we will never succeed.
It's difficult.
Because I think taking in consideration the daily pressure that we face, climate change would be not a priority.
Sorry, one moment. Your sound is very broken up. I'm wondering if you could switch off your video for a moment, and then we'll go with the sound, and hopefully the bandwidth has improved. So I'm sorry, if you could start again.
Is it better now?
Unfortunately, it's not very good right now. Maybe we'll give it a minute and come back to you.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, so I'll come back to you in a moment. I guess there are a number of other questions out there. What I've heard in response then to Patrick's call for an ideological leap, especially one centered around capitalism and its role in articulating various kinds of oppressions, is that it has to be considered in intersectional terms. Capitalism as an intersectional system producing a variety of kinds of oppression and forms of super exploitation that require that we also name racism, white supremacy, patriarchy, at the same time that we make a leap to locating capitalism as central to the challenges facing humanity. Patrick, would you say that's an adequate response to your call for an ideological leap?
It is interesting because the traditions which you've just implied that combine race, gender, the ecological appropriation by capitalism, I think those traditions come from Rosa Luxemburg and, a wide variety here in Africa. Samir Amin stands high as somebody who contributed to this political economic theory. It's about capitalism and the non-capitalist, the super exploitation. I'm not sure if it's appropriate to ask, because I certainly can do so with my students since we're so irrelevant, but whether those on the front lines of some of the greatest struggles find that it really helps drive forward the militancy, the consciousness, the commitment of people to say, we can name this in a way that also relates to Israeli capitalism and US imperialism in the Middle East, or the ways in which Central America's drawn into the world economy. I mean, these are the sort of, let's call it world systems, in honor of one of the comrades who passed away last year, Emmanuel Wallerstein, to make all these connections, but to see that there's an internal logic that also, capitalism, non-capitalism, articulations of modes of production that helped explain for so many great thinkers, I'm thinking of, say, Ben Magubani, why capitalism and apartheid worked so well together, why contradictions emerged, but why ultimately this period of capitalism seems to require an accumulation by dispossession that is super exploitative across the sphere of our struggles.
Rose, if we could go back to this point then, as reparations being one of those red lines that Biden will not cross, or is unlikely to even entertain. How do you see a demand not only for reparations in the United States, but a global sense, global reparations that also apply to the questions of to the realities of climate change and climate injustice?
Well, let's start with Biden in the U.S. I think he's getting a bit beside himself to be non-negotiable about reparations, given how his, quote, victory was catalyzed by the very people that he has to answer to. And I don't think these struggles are going to disappear, unlike under Obama, but have some real legs to them. And so we'll see how sturdy his position will be regarding not only reparations, but some of the left agenda that certainly were not incorporated in the Democratic platform, but people are holding strong to. He also has to worry about the catalyzing of energy to get those 2 Senate seats. So I think we don't want to get a little bit ahead of ourselves in terms of what kind of final stance Joe Biden can take regarding any of these issues. I mean, I think there really is quite a bit of energy that's been catalyzed, and that's not going away so easily. The second aspect or part of your question regarding climate, obviously, the earth, Mother Nature, the very things that sustain us, we might be at the point of extinction. So obviously, it has to be seriously interrogated and incorporated into the broader global solidarity movements that we're talking about. But the way it's been articulated, and I was in Paris, and actually I was in, once Chile was out, I was in Spain, interestingly enough, in Madrid, where you probably can't go right now. So I'm very well aware, but once again, back to the point that was made by Ana, it can't be a singular, insular kind of push, not given the history of colonized people, not given the history of white supremacy in the US. It has to be re-articulated in the context of those multiple struggles.
Thank you, Rose. We have a question that actually gets to the question of how we articulate these various multiple struggles on a global terrain. What is the space available to us? And so I'd like to turn to Ruby, who has a question. Ruby, would you unmute yourself and present your question?
Hi, yes, thank you. Thank you for giving me the opportunity. I've been following what's been happening in the US for a while now, and I realized, something that comes up very often, especially since I am from the Middle East, is, in my mind, is given the issues that the US is facing right now, and a lot of us realizing that its, omnipresence is questioned or questionable or can be questioned. I keep thinking about when could a lot of the countries, especially since I work in international development, when could a lot of these countries stand up and, say, thank you, but now you've kind of lost your power here. We're, coming together to do something else. And I think that's very much related to all these movements at the international level, whether it be, the civil society movements or otherwise. I keep struggling with the idea of, yes, there is a hegemony, but when can we stand up? When can we find an alternative? And what is this alternative?
Okay. Thank you, Ruby. So the central question of our times, really, right? Rose, would you like to take a first stab at it?
I would only say this, it is a wounded empire, an empire that still controls too much of financialization, and also an empire that has used economic sanctions in a way that have been horrific for many, many countries in the world. So it's not dead yet, it's limping, and it controls the military industrial complex, as someone referenced, with 800 military bases around the world, and every day putting money into building even more deadly weaponry. So that's very much a serious proposition, both the economic possibilities that are still inherent in this system, as well as its military and war machine, where, at least $1 trillion is invested. So yeah, definitely, there have been some promising possibilities. Especially was it exciting as before Chavez passed away. And, I don't think it's an impossibility, but the real politics of it and the fact that these many sub-empires that Patrick referenced, the Modis and the Bolsonaros, it's the geopolitics of this difficult to say the least. That's my 2 cents.
On the theme of a difficult geopolitics, could we return to Sahar and see if her audio is improved and if she has a chance to address this question? Sahar, are you still with us?
Yes, I am. Is it okay now?
This is perfect, yes.
Yeah.
Great.
Okay, so before asking what Ruby was raising, let me go back a bit for the climate change issue. I think thinking about Israel as one of the first countries on technologies and military industry and all these capitalist things, I don't think they care much about climate change and the impact of their industry, actually, especially on the agriculture area on the earth. So I think this is why Palestinians need really to connect with the global movement on the climate change struggle, and to include the Palestinian problems on the water, on the land, on the agriculture, and all these issues in the global fight. And brings me as well to the PDS issue. We should look into the international companies that are involved in such industries that affects the climate change and cause damage, in order to ask to divest and to sanction them, and not just when it's a company that involved in the occupation itself. And this is an idea how we can make our struggle joint together. It's not just about Palestine to be free, but it's about colonialism and all the associated policies of colonialism, not just in Palestine, but everywhere. When we would stand, I hope, I think it's a complicated issue. It's not easy to give answer because there's lots of different circumstances now with the COVID and all the lockdown, for example, here in Palestine, because we ask ourselves every day why we are silent, why we even agree to the decisions that the Palestinian Authority is making in our names, and it's not good for us because of people are not people are really facing very, very difficult situations. I think people are aware that they need to go back to the struggle and to revolution, but maybe it's not the time yet, at least here in the Palestinian context, I mean.
Thank you, Sahar. I would like to turn to another theme raised in the chat area. Both Rose in her last remarks and Patrick referred to the pink tide, a brief period of hope, and unfortunately by the second decade of the century largely dashed. Without that, Patrick has offered us an example of an international social movement campaign. And he's written about it in the chat. Patrick, could you go back to those comments and sort of say it out for everyone to be able to listen to, particularly those who won't have access to the chat?
Oh, yeah, sure. Well, look, commoning is where I want to end, but to get there as a general strategy of the international independent left grounded in mass social movements, whether it be land through Via Campesina or the water struggles to get free public water supply that we've had here in South Africa that Cochabamba, Bolivia pioneered, in the Water Warriors Network. I mean, there are lots of these. One People's Health Council being terribly important with COVID-19 vaccine watching and IP critics. I think that we do have a good example that transcends what the pink tide did, which was to give us hope that electoral social democratic opportunities in poor countries were still there. Let's be frank, though. I mean, there are very good critics in places like Venezuela and Bolivia and Ecuador, whom I listen to very carefully, who say the hydrocarbon-centric character of accumulation and state, surplus extraction meant they were pretty flawed in these profound ways of addressing the climate contradictions. So let me use a better example, and that is, as you say, Sharon, we've had a social movement in this country, the Treatment Action Campaign, De-link, force a government, which was, frankly, AIDS denialist, some say genocidal, because big pharma corps internationally said, if you're going to have AIDS medicines, for South Africa, about 7 million people here living with HIV, you're going to have to pay, and it was $20,000 a year at one point. So to de-link from that extreme exploitation, a movement around the world, I mean, in the US, let's say ACT UP was critical in this, or Médecins Sans Frontières in doing the practical delivery of these AIDS medicines. But they had to be generic, not branded. So the intellectual property had to be fought in the World Trade Organization, trade and intellectual property trips. And because of the upsurge of anger, 40 million people at the time living with HIV, the anger at the big pharma corps and, U.S. government and WTO, all of these big corporate powers supporting big pharma's IP. Because of that, the reaction was so strong, and with generics available through India, with at that time a good Brazilian state program, the comrades here did actually reverse policy and get these medicines out. 7 million people now accessing them. And life expectancy went from 52 to 65 as a result of this being decommodified, destratified, deglobalized, produced here, produced in Uganda and Zimbabwe, all over the continent. And I think with the vaccine being a big debate now, that's obviously a very good precedent that the COVID-19 and AIDS have these commonalities, but we need the social movements to revive and say, yeah, we need to decommodify. So that's my delinking example to Ruby. If our state elites aren't ready, well, we've got some extraordinary examples. I mean, I think Argentines who threw out Suez and inspired my Johannesburg comrades in Soweto to throw out Suez, right, which was this big water company from Paris privatizing water. We could go through many examples of activists who've been very, very committed to doing critiques of international corporate power and deglobalizing. And in a way, what's BDS, if not exactly that, delegitimizing and weakening those systems of international capitalist power. We have some good examples, even if attempts through states have fallen short.
Thank you, Patrick. Given the hour, I'm afraid these are going to have to be our last remarks, and we'll take that as your closing remark. One very fitting, because you end with the solutions of delinking and commoning. I'd like to also announce that Ana Silvia has had to leave to her next meeting, and so we won't have a closing remark from her. I'd like to turn then very quickly to Sahar and then back to Rose for their last remarks before I say a few words at the end. So Sahar, do you have any final sort of summary remarks, or should I say provisional remarks for us that we can move to the next few conversations with?
Thanks a lot. And I think I will just end with the request that really solidarity on the international level to rebuild the movement is needed in order to face colonization and all strategies associated with colonization in Palestine and in other places.
Thank you, Sahar. I think all of us on this call certainly hear that demand for solidarity. And with that in mind, I'd like to turn to Rose to sort of close our event and address these questions of delinking, commoning as ways in which social movements, rather than or in addition to states, can exercise popular sovereignty and demand and make changes directly. Rose?
Yeah, I will bypass those two solutions and say they're rather narrow, but that the energy within the belly of the beast is quite huge. I do think that there's a developing consciousness and a new commitment that I would like to see really catalyze much more deeply. People are realizing who are committed to deep level structural change, that being central in this behemoth gives us a great deal of determining power, given the history of empire, imperialism, and the US role in it. But for ever so long, it has been really very erased. And these last months and the work and the folk on the ground, and it would be wonderful to have some of the activists who are doing this to get a real first-hand look-see at the energy and power. We need we need a transnational, internationalist vision, and it has to go at the heart of this behemoth that we're dealing with. So I guess I would close on those observations.
Thank you, Rose. I'd like to turn now to my co-facilitator, Liz Mestris, who has a few closing comments and observations. Liz.
Thanks. Yes, I was going to respond some to what was evoked from some of Patrick's comments on the pink tide. And I just wanted to point out that 2 weeks or so, a little more before our US elections, the Bolivian elections returned the Movement for Socialism's party to power after the coup of last year of Evo Morales. And the original coming of Evo Morales to power was from the water wars. I mean, so of the 2006 or so, I think it was, where the mass movements literally removed the several presidents from power. And so the movements from below were totally incredible. The other point about all of that is, here in Mexico, a central issue is that the water supply, the watershed, the cuenca is almost dry. So, and that it's so deep that, so low, the water supply, that it's now with contaminated with arsenic and fluoride and undrinkable. So here, the main culprit for that, and so a lot of the social struggles around that, but the main culprit in this is that about 90% of the water is used for industrial agriculture for export. So like it connects very much to the very broad, how do we live, you know, in the most basic. And the interrelationship of the environmental, the social, the political, and the climate. I really think climate is totally totally pivotal, but it's a piece of the whole system, right? And okay. But anyway, I was very appreciative of these discussions and want to thank everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Liz. So I would like to announce then that our next event will happen in early January and address the topic of the World Social Forum. It will be announced on our website, movementsofmovements.net. In addition to thanking our speakers, Patrick, Ana Silvia, Sahar, and Rose, I want to also thank Kolya Abramsky, Walden Bello, Marie Cruz Soto, and Charlotte O'Neill, who opened this conversation a month ago and whose video is online at our website. I also, of course, have to thank Sienna Mann and Hina Vargas, who provided interpretation, and our co-organizers, Liz Mestris, Matt Meyer, Joy Sen, and Hina Vargas. Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Sharon. Madla. Away too.